Hey folks, welcome to the Ramble. So I was looking over the Washington Post this morning, as I occasionally do when I'm trying to figure out exactly what I want to talk about, what I want to share with you on these alternate Mondays. And I found a column by George Will, who is a conservative Republican who I still will pay irregular attention to, because I do actually like to at least cast a glance in that direction from time to time to see what people on the right-wing side of things are talking about and thinking. And George Will, although I disagree with him vociferously quite often, is someone who I at least find tolerable through our disagreements. And he has a column in the Washington Post. It's his syndicated column for this week, and it's about Gerald Ford. And the headline is "The President We Didn't Know We Always Wanted," which sounds like the title of a sentimental poem that somebody would read at somebody's funeral. And that's basically what the column is. It's a warm remembrance and celebration of Gerald Ford in the light of the current presidency. And I find it interesting in the article that in celebrating Ford, Will has very little to say in terms of Ford's actual accomplishments as president. And maybe you could say, well, that makes sense because Ford doesn't really have that many notable accomplishments. His presidency was a short one. It was an unanticipated one, and he was sort of just there steering the ship until somebody more permanent came along. But when I look through Ford's Wikipedia page, because I have to admit, I am not a Gerald Ford historian. Ford served before I was born, and I have never really read a whole lot about Ford's presidency in particular. So to get a basic idea, just an overview of what his presidency was and the major events that marked it, I skimmed through his Wikipedia page. And there are actually some accomplishments to point to in Ford's presidency. Or if not accomplishments, then at least things that look well on him, things that put him in a good light. And I wonder why George Will, in celebrating Ford, doesn't mention those things. It's probably because those are things that I consider admirable as a more liberal, left-leaning person, that George Will, as a more right-leaning, right-wing person, probably doesn't consider that admirable. For instance, Gerald Ford was a supporter of the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, the amendment that would enshrine women's equality, gender equality in the Constitution. Ford was a supporter of that. To me, that's a big deal. That's a big check in the yes column for me. George Will doesn't mention it. Ford was also possibly the last American president, I haven't done my homework on that, but I would imagine it's been a while, to actually stand up to the state of Israel in negotiations regarding Middle East peace negotiations, Middle East peace procedures. There was a crisis during Ford's presidency, and Ford actually suspended U.S. aid to Israel because he considered Israel's conduct in the situation to be unacceptable. And when was the last time a U.S. president even threatened to do that, let alone actually did it, and pissed off a lot of people in Congress in both parties, but especially in the Republican Party, for failing to stand by Israel? What he really seems to be praising Ford for is that he stepped into the White House and he allowed things to not get any worse. And I suppose in the situation that Ford was in, that's not nothing. He could have made things a lot worse. But George Will refers to Ford as the president we always wanted, but that we didn't know we had. And when he says that, he is actually quoting Donald Rumsfeld. And right there is a big point of departure between myself and George Will, because I do not consider Donald Rumsfeld to be a person who should ever be afforded deferential attention. I think Donald Rumsfeld's service to the United States government, by and large, has been to the great detriment of the country and the people, and to quite a few people in quite a few countries other than the United States as well. So not a big fan of Donald Rumsfeld, not a big fan of quoting Donald Rumsfeld admiringly or as some kind of reliable source. But he quotes Rumsfeld about Ford, saying that Ford was, he was a stable, decent presence in the White House, and that was a good thing. But things get really bizarre at the end of Will's piece here, because he spends most of the piece talking about how, Gerald Ford, he came into a tough spot. He was a decent guy. He did the best he could. He kept things stable. He held things together for his presidency until democracy could take back over and we could elect a new president and the country could move on. And that's, I kind of agree with the thesis there that that's not nothing, that Ford deserves at least, some appreciation for that. But then he ends with this. He says, and I'm quoting here, "The current president's contribution, unintended but not insignificant, to America's civic health might be to help cure the country of unreasonable fastidiousness regarding presidential aspirants. For a while at least, many voters will be less inclined than they once were to measure candidates with a political micrometer that encourages voters to be excessively finicky, rejecting candidates for minor blemishes, only to wind up with one who is all blemish. More than 4 decades on from Ford's accidental presidency, this man who wore plaid trousers and wore power lightly is a reminder that the nation can always do worse than to embrace normality." Is that really the lesson that we're going to take from the Trump presidency? I mean, it's a very fine, subtle point that he's making there, that if we turn our noses up at candidates who don't have a spotless political record, we run the risk of electing a president who, as Will says, is all blemish. But I can't help but notice that in the wake of the Trump presidency, in the wake of the embarrassment, the disaster that the Trump presidency has been, the almost unimaginable daily phantasmagoric nightmare of Donald Trump as president, that a lot of people on the left as well as the right have become a lot more forgiving of the mediocrities that not only ran for president, but that we elected president. It's one thing to point out Gerald Ford as a beacon of normality and decency and to compare him to Trump and say, well, maybe he wasn't all that well prepared to be the president either. He had never appeared on a national ballot before, and yet he did okay. And maybe we should ease off on people like Ford who run for president and maybe don't have a spotless resume or a sterling set of recommendations to hold the office. Maybe we should factor in things like personality, like decency, like temperament. And that's fair. But I can't help but notice that Republicans and Democrats in the last couple of years aren't just giving some overdue but measured and limited appreciation to Gerald Ford. They've also been rehabilitating George W. Bush, who not only was a very mediocre president and a mediocre human being at best, but also started a couple wars that got a whole lot of people killed, a whole lot of people in this country and a whole lot more people in other countries as well, people who did not need to die, and created a situation that is still ongoing in the world today. I really don't think it's good for us to look at Donald Trump and say, oh my God, what a fucking nightmare. Hey, you know who was pretty good actually? George W. Bush. No. Yes, compared to Donald Trump, yes, George W. Bush is preferable. But that doesn't mean he was good. It doesn't mean we should look back nostalgically at the Bush years, domestically or internationally. I think George W. Bush was a terrible president. The fact that Donald Trump is an even worse president doesn't mean all of a sudden that George W. Bush was a good president, or that we should be looking to him as a source of wisdom and looking to him as, we're sorry we didn't appreciate you at the time, George. We appreciated him too much at the time. We reelected him. He got more than he deserved at the time. Just because Trump is even worse doesn't mean we look back at the mediocrities that we elected, like George W. Bush, like his father, George H.W. Bush, who was an even better president than George W. Bush was, but still doesn't deserve to be venerated. Like Gerald Ford, who seems like he was a decent guy and did an okay job and was certainly a more moderate Republican than we elected subsequently, but doesn't really deserve to be appreciated all that much, except for, as I said, the fact that he did support ERA, which is good. He did stand up to Israel, which was good. I didn't mention this, he created a clemency program for people who fled the country to escape the draft during Vietnam. That was good. Those are all good things. But let's not chisel the fucker's face on Mount Rushmore quite yet. Let's not allow the wall-to-wall shit show that is the Trump administration to cause us to be more forgiving than we ought to be to past presidents who maybe were not nearly as bad as Trump, and unlike Trump, at least had their saving graces here and there, but by no means were great presidents or even particularly good presidents. They were adequate presidents, I would say, in the case of President Ford. He was an adequate president. Doesn't exactly deserve the soft glow romantic picture that is painted of him by Rumsfeld and by George Will here. Let's not allow the awfulness of the present caused by Trump and his administration and his supporters to give the past too much of a rosy tint, because that will not do us any favors now or in the future.